Week 1 of a brand new league is always exciting, because nobody truly knows what's going to happen. These are 8 new teams who have been together for a few practices and have never played against each other in a competitive environment before. Nobody knows what teams are good and what teams aren't. And even after the first week for the most part, it's way too early to tell. We don't know who's good and who's bad. Are the Roughnecks one of the best teams in the league, or do the Wildcats just look that bad? Everything's up in the air. And after 1 week, and with 9 more weeks of the regular season to go, we will know the contenders and the pretenders sometime in the next few weeks. Basically, with a league like this, it's not a great idea to put a whole lot of stock into week 1. Unless you're a fan of the Tampa Bay Vipers. Because if previous history is anything to go off of, they're in serious trouble. Tampa Bay entered this season as one of the favorites to win the league. They were regarded by many as the best team in the East Division. They had a recognizable name at quarterback, with former Georgia star Aaron Murray. They had a 3-time Grey Cup champion at head coach in Mark Trestman. People thought that this team was going to be good. But in week 1 against the New York Guardians, man did they fall flat. Tampa Bay lost the game by a final score of 23-3. Aaron Murray threw 2 interceptions. Trestman seemed to have no idea what he was doing with his 2-quarterback system of Murray and Flowers. Oddly enough, the Vipers outgained the Guardians in net yards by a large margin, outgaining them 394-226. But when you go 0 for 4 in goal-to-go situations, you have a missed field goal, 2 turnovers, and then 2 turnovers on downs, you're not going to win the game most of the time. 4 teams lost in the first week of the season. So why am I not saying any of this about the LA Wildcats, the Seattle Dragons, or the Dallas Renegades? Because those 3 teams put up points. The Vipers only scored 3. And based off of the history of previous leagues, the Vipers might be in serious trouble going forward. Let's take a deep dive into this. For this, I took a look at every major national startup league since World War II, whether they were trying to compete with the NFL or not. These are the leagues that most people think about when they're asked to think of a football league that's not named the NFL. There are 8 leagues that fit into this description. These are the All-American Football Conference from 1946, the American Football League from 1960, the World Football League from 1974, the United States Football League from 1983, the World League of American Football from 1991, which later became known as NFL Europe, the original XFL from 2001, the United Football League from 2009, and the Alliance of American Football from 2019. I looked at these 8 leagues, and I looked strictly at the team's first game from the inaugural season. The whole point of this is that every team is a new expansion team on a level playing field. So as an example, I'm not looking at anything that the Miami Dolphins or the Cincinnati Bengals did in their first year of the AFL, because they came into the league later on, and they were facing established teams that had been around for a while. Expansion teams in an established league are not supposed to be good or competitive. I'm strictly looking at expansion teams in a league full of expansion teams. So in those 8 leagues that I just mentioned, I looked at each team's first ever game played. Then, I established a baseline. Did those teams manage to score 7 points in their inaugural game? 7 just seems like an easy number, because under a conventional scoring system, it's a touchdown and an extra point. If they scored at least 7, they're fine. If they couldn't score 7 points in their first game, I made a note of it. Then, I looked at the teams that couldn't reach that 7-point baseline and checked how they did throughout the rest of the season. In total, excluding the Vipers in their inaugural game against the Guardians, I found 11 teams that couldn't reach that threshold. Let's take a look at them. Starting in the inaugural season of the AAFC in 1946, there were 2 teams that struggled to get anything going offensively in their first game. We'll start with the Miami Seahawks. After losing their first game to the Cleveland Browns by a final score of 44-0, they wound up finishing at the bottom of the league with a 3-11 record. In their 14 games, they averaged a mere 11.9 points per game, which was the worst total in the league. Then, you've got the Chicago Rockets, who were idle in week 1 and didn't end up playing their first game until week 2, also oddly enough against the Cleveland Browns. Chicago lost this game 20-6. They finished the season last in their division with a 5-6-3 record, and they finished 5th out of 8 teams in points per game. Both teams in the AAFC that couldn't reach this threshold were in the bottom half of the league in points scored, and they were last in their respective divisions. Moving over to the American Football League in 1960, the Buffalo Bills did not get off to a good start when they lost 27-3 to the New York Titans in their opening game. Buffalo finished the season with a 5-8-1 record and had the second worst offense in the league on a points per game average. In the World Football League from 1974, the Houston Texans lost their opening game to the Chicago Fire by a final score of 17-0. They couldn't put anything on the board. Turns out, this disaster on the field was a sign of things to come, both on and off the field, as they wound up relocating to Shreveport in the middle of the season and changing their name to the Shreveport Steamer. The WFL was kind of a mess, as are most of these startup leagues. The Houston Shreveport Steamer Texans of Anaheim finished the season second to last in the league in points per game, finishing 11th out of 12 teams. And they finished last in the Western Division with a 7-12-1 record. Yes, they played 20 games in a season back then. Going to the United States Football League from 1983, the Arizona Wranglers lost their opening game to the Oakland Invaders by a lot, losing the game 24-0. Arizona would not improve the rest of the way. They finished dead last in the league in points per game, finishing 12th out of 12 teams. And they were tied with the Washington Federals for the worst record in the league, ending the season with an abysmal 4-14 record. There were 2 instances in the World League of American Football from 1991 of a team not crossing this threshold. First, you had the Birmingham Fire, who lost their opening game to the Montreal Machine by a bizarre scoreline of 20-5. For those wondering, yes, that would be a scoregami in the NFL if that were to happen today. Birmingham had the second worst offense in the league, finishing 9th out of 10 teams. However, they somehow made the playoffs, because all of the North American teams that season stunk. Seriously, none of the 7 North American teams finished above 500, and Birmingham was one of the least awful ones of the bunch. So they got in, and they promptly lost to Barcelona in the semifinals. Who was the worst offense that season? That would be the Raleigh-Durham Skyhawks, who lost 9-3 in their opening game against the Sacramento Surge, couldn't cross that threshold, finishing 10th out of 10 teams in points per game, and they ended the season winless with an 0-10 record. Now we move to the original incarnation of the XFL from 2001. In the very first game showcased by the league, the New York, New Jersey Hitmen lost 19-0 to the Las Vegas Outlaws. The Hitmen finished 7th out of 8 teams in the league in points per game, and they finished the season with a losing record of 4-6. Things are looking much more promising for the New York, New Jersey team this year, if Sunday's game against Tampa Bay was any indication. I said that I counted the United Football League's inaugural season from 2009, but none of those teams ended up mattering, as all 4 teams in that league crossed the threshold in Week 1. So we moved to the last league in this experiment, and that was last year's Alliance of American Football. The opening week, for the most part, was a display of offensive futility, as there were not 1, not 2, but 3 teams that couldn't cross that threshold. The Atlanta Legends lost 40-6 to the Orlando Apollos, the Memphis Express got shut out 26-0 at the hands of the Birmingham Iron, and the San Diego Fleet lost 15-6 to the San Antonio Commanders. Atlanta, Memphis, and San Diego all finished the abbreviated season with losing records, and outside of what ended up turning out to be a non-existent playoff picture. Atlanta had the worst offense in points per game, and Memphis and San Diego were both in the bottom half of the league in this category as well. Coincidentally, Vipers quarterback Aaron Murray was a member of that disastrous Legends team. So that's 11 teams that couldn't score at least 7 points in their inaugural game. All 11 of those teams wound up finishing the season at or below 500. All 11 of those teams wound up in the bottom half of the league in points per game. The combined records of these teams was 40-89-5, which is a winning percentage of 31.7%. In the NFL, this roughly equates to a 5-11 season. None of these offenses improved drastically. None of these teams got better, and 8 of the 11 teams finished either last or second to last in the league in points per game. And even that's a bit misleading, because in the AAF, 3 teams couldn't meet that threshold, so by default, one of those teams had to finish outside the bottom 2. So what's the takeaway from all of this? The Vipers scoring just 3 points in their inaugural game against the Guardians is not a good sign going forward. If previous history is anything to go off of, they are in serious trouble. We don't know a lot about these teams and how good they are right now, but we've got a pretty bad feeling about Tampa Bay, because let's just say that history is not on their side.